You don't live in a democracy. You live in a financial system, one that quietly decides who wins wars, who builds empires, and who stays poor. It doesn't wear a crown and it doesn't need an army. It rules through contracts, credit, and quiet compliance. Most people never notice it because it doesn't need to hide. The greatest trick money ever pulled was convincing the world it was neutral. We were taught that money is just a tool, a measure of value, a way to trade one thing for another. But what if that's the myth? What if money isn't a tool at all but a system of control, one designed not to measure value but to extract it? This story isn't about villains in dark boardrooms. It's about centuries of quiet engineering by merchants, kings, and bankers who learned how to turn promises into power. To really understand it, you have to go back to when money was still real. When wealth meant something you could touch: gold, silver, salt, grain. Things you could hold, trade, and store. For most of human history, money represented something concrete: labor, land, or metal. If you wanted more, you had to earn it or take it. But then slowly a new idea began to spread, one that would change everything. What if money didn't have to exist as long as people believed it did? The first glimpse of this illusion came in 11th century China under the Song dynasty. The empire had grown so vast that hauling coins across it became impossible. So the government started issuing paper notes, promises backed by nothing but imperial decree. And it worked. The economy boomed, merchants thrived. But when too many notes were printed, trust collapsed, and so did the currency. The experiment was shelved for a while. Centuries later, in medieval Europe, merchants in the Italian city-states rediscovered the power of promises. Carrying gold across dangerous trade routes was slow and risky. So they created letters of credit, written pledges of value that could be redeemed elsewhere. It was safer, faster, and invisible to thieves. But most importantly, it was profitable. Because paper can multiply in ways gold never could. That was the birth of the modern illusion, the separation of money from matter. And no one mastered it quite like the Medici. In 15th century Florence, their family bank became the beating heart of Europe's economy, financing kings, popes, and wars. They pioneered double-entry bookkeeping, which might sound boring, but it changed civilization. For the first time, money could be created with ink instead of metal. Every loan became an asset, every debt a source of wealth. The Medici didn't just record value, they manufactured it. And in doing so, they quietly replaced monarchs with merchants. But they were only the beginning. By the 1600s, money evolved again. The Dutch Republic, a small windswept nation, turned trade into empire with a new invention: the joint stock company. The Dutch East India Company sold shares to investors, pooled their money, and built an empire of ships, spice, and silver. Ordinary citizens could now profit from global conquest without ever leaving home. Profit was no longer tied to work, it was tied to ownership. The company became richer than kingdoms, and for the first time the line between state and corporation blurred. England soon copied the model and perfected it. The British East India Company became part business, part government. It had its own armies, its own taxes, even its own currency. It didn't just trade goods, it ruled people. And as it did, London became the new center of global finance. Behind the Union Jack balance sheets ruled the seas. But the real turning point came in 1694 with the creation of the Bank of England. The government, drowning in war debt, turned to private financiers for help. In return, those bankers got the right to issue notes, paper money backed by the government's own debt. It was a brilliant paradox: the more the government owed, the more money it could print. Debt wasn't a weakness anymore. It became the engine of empire. For the first time in history, nations could expand faster than their economies. War, once limited by resources, became limitless because money could now be created out of belief. From that moment on, money and power were inseparable. Kings no longer ruled bankers, bankers ruled kings. By the 18th century, the architecture was complete. Gold was just a reference, paper was reality. Every banknote was a promise, a claim on metal stored somewhere else, though few ever saw it. The system worked because people agreed not to question it. And as long as that faith held, the machine could grow forever. Then came the industrial era, and with it, scale. The 19th century saw the rise of global banking dynasties: the Rothschilds, the Morgans, the Barings. They didn't just lend money, they shaped nations. They brokered peace, funded revolutions, and financed both sides of wars. Their real product wasn't gold or bonds, it was trust. They understood something profound. Money was never really about metal, it was about confidence. And confidence could be manufactured. Every crisis made them stronger. When governments went broke, bankers rescued them in exchange for control. When markets crashed, they stabilized them for a price. By the end of the 19th century, the world had entered a new order. Nations still existed, but the true empire was financial. The flags were symbolic, the credit was real. The 20th century only tightened the grip. In 1913, the United States, a rising industrial giant, created the Federal Reserve. Officially, it was meant to stabilize the economy. In practice, it gave private banks the power to issue public money. The government no longer created currency, it borrowed it with interest. Printing became policy, democracy became debt management. A few decades later, World War II reshaped the global map. In 1944, world leaders met in Bretton Woods to design a new economic order. The United States dollar became the anchor of global trade, pegged to gold. Every other currency pegged to the dollar. On paper, it looked like stability. In reality, it made the entire world dependent on American policy. Whoever controlled the dollar controlled the system. And when President Nixon ended the gold standard in 1971, that dependency became absolute. The dollar was no longer backed by anything, just belief. Fiat money was born, currency backed not by metal or productivity but by faith. Money had finally become pure abstraction. And in that abstraction, power became invisible. For the first time in history, growth didn't need resources, it just needed credit. Governments borrowed to spend. Corporations borrowed to expand. Consumers borrowed to survive. And the world kept spinning, not on wealth but on debt. That's the system trap. A structure so vast it doesn't need conspiracies, it just needs participation. Every paycheck, every mortgage, every credit card balance keeps it alive. You can't see it, you can only feel it in the rising cost of living. In the price of your time. In that quiet anxiety whispering that no matter how hard you work, you're never really ahead. Look around, every modern life runs on debt. Students borrow to enter the system. Homeowners borrow to stay in it. Governments borrow to pretend it's still growing. And the more everyone borrows, the more valuable money becomes for those who issue it. The cycle feeds itself. New debt pays old debt. New credit creates new power. And every dollar of interest flows upward to the institutions that can create money faster than anyone can earn it. You can't see the rulers of this system because they don't look like rulers. They wear suits, not crowns. They meet in boardrooms, not palaces. And they rule through numbers, not laws. The modern state, the market, and the central bank are now one entity, a symbiosis of convenience. The government spends. The central bank prints. The market inflates. And the bill lands on everyone else through inflation, the quiet tax on the unaware. The slow theft of time and labor disguised as rising prices. We think inflation is random, it's not. It's design. It's how the system resets without reforming. Because when too much money is printed, debt must be erased without saying default. Inflation does that silently. It punishes savers, rewards debtors, and keeps the wheel turning. Every decade, the middle class loses a little more and the wealthy lose a little less. But in absolute terms, they never lose. Because they own the assets that rise with the tide. The 2008 financial crisis made it crystal clear. When the system collapsed under its own weight, governments didn't punish the gamblers. They rescued them. Trillions of dollars were created overnight, not to save people who lost homes, but to save the institutions that caused the collapse. Central banks called it quantitative easing. In reality, it was debt reincarnation, money conjured from nothing to preserve everything. And people accepted it because they had no choice. You can't revolt against the currency you're paid in. You can't rebel against the bank that holds your mortgage. The system doesn't survive through violence. It survives through dependence. You can opt out of politics. You can't opt out of money. And the next evolution of control isn't coming, it's already here. Digital money. Central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, are being tested worldwide. They promise efficiency, transparency, convenience. But they also erase the last illusion of privacy. Every transaction recorded. Every purchase traceable. Every account programmable. Money that can be frozen, redirected, or deleted with a few keystrokes. It's not conspiracy, it's policy. This is the logical endpoint of a 700-year journey. From gold coins to credit cards, from merchant ledgers to blockchain algorithms. The same mechanism perfected. The only thing that changed is how visible it's allowed to be. In this new order, freedom becomes conditional not by decree but by design. A programmable economy where incentives replace laws. Where your score replaces your sovereignty. Where compliance is built into code. And because it's efficient, people will accept it. Just like they accepted the printing press, the central bank. And the idea that debt equals growth. That's how the system trap works. It doesn't demand submission. It makes it comfortable. Meanwhile, the distractions never stop: left versus right, rich versus poor, good versus evil. But the real divide isn't ideological. It's structural. Between those who understand the system and those who live inside it. The first group shapes reality. The second experiences it. And here's the part most people miss. There's no single villain. There's just momentum. The system doesn't need conspirators, it runs on incentives so powerful that good people follow them without question. Politicians chase growth because voters demand it. Banks create credit because markets reward it. Consumers take loans because survival requires it. The cycle continues not because of greed but because of gravity. That's the genius of it. The trap isn't out there, it's in here, built into our ambitions, our habits, our hopes. Every time we borrow, spend, or save in a currency we don't control, we participate. Every time we measure success in dollars instead of value, we reinforce the very power we claim to hate. But history gives perspective and hope. Because no illusion lasts forever. Every empire of credit eventually collapses under its own contradictions. Rome debased its currency until soldiers demanded goods instead of coins. The French monarchy printed assignats until bread riots burned through Paris. The British pound ruled the world until the cost of empire outgrew its means. Every time the pattern ends the same way, belief breaks. And when that happens, the survivors aren't the richest. They're the ones who understand what money really is. Not wealth but trust. Not power but agreement. When that agreement fractures, the system resets. And those who saw it coming rebuild from the ruins. We might already be close to that breaking point. Debt levels are historic. Inflation is structural. Nations borrow just to pay interest. Productivity stagnates while paper wealth explodes. The illusion still holds, but only because we've never known anything else. So how do you escape the system trap? You can't destroy it. You outgrow it. Learn how it works. Stop confusing digits with value. Build things the system can't print: knowledge, skills, relationships, real assets, independent thought. The more of those you own, the less control it has. Because there's one currency the system can't inflate: awareness. Money rules the world because we let it. But history reminds us every system that rules eventually serves. And when this one breaks, as they all do, the people who understand the past won't be victims of the collapse. They'll be the authors of what comes next. History doesn't repeat. But if you don't understand it, it'll crush you just the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers, it'll show you where to look.